I would like to thank Caressing Me Night for sending me the story, and trust and believe I hate having to use this image as much. So you all know that this man is like one of the biggest opposers of ADOS receiving reparations. Well, what I'm about to tell you is going to be very, very interesting. So according to NBCnews.com, Mitch McConnell's great-great-grandfathers, not grandfather as in one, but grandfathers as in multiple, owned 14 slaves. Makes you wonder, what did he own any of your ancestors? To the ones listening, hell, did his grandfathers own any of mine? Let me get into this article. McConnell has opposed paying reparations to descendants of slaves, though census records show his family, like many others, benefited from their labor. I bet Mitch McConnell knew this all along, but he didn't want it to get out because he knew that this would not be a good look for him, considering his position. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who said recently he opposes paying government reparations to the descendants of American slaves, has a family history deeply entwined in the issue. Two of his great-great-grandfathers were slave owners. The two great-great-grandfathers, James McConnell and Richard Daley, owned a total of at least 14 slaves in Limestone County, Alabama, all but two of them female. Well, how about that? All but two of them female, according to the county slave schedules in the 1850 to 1860 census. The detail about McConnell's ancestors, discovered by NBC News through a search of ancestry and census records, came in the wake of recent hearings on reparations before the House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties. Asked about the reparations issues, McConnell said he was opposed to the idea, arguing it would be too hard to figure out whom to compensate. Well, guess what, McConnell? We can just figure out through the census, which slaves were owned by your great-great-grandfathers, and we can start there. Remember, this is the same guy that said that Barack Hussein Obama, number 44, was going to be our form of reparations. This is the same guy that said that he would be a one-term president. Same exact guy. The details about McConnell's ancestors discovered by NBC News through a search of ancestry and census records came in the wake of recent hearings. I'm sorry, I'm reading the same part again, excuse me. I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, when none of us currently living are responsible, is a good idea. But Mitch McConnell, you are currently living and you're benefiting. So what does that make you? He says, we've tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation. We've elected an African American president. NBC News, in several phone calls and in emails to McConnell's office, asked if the senator was aware that his great-great-grandfathers were slave owners. The office did not respond to those requests. Of course, they're not going to respond to it, because either answer that they give is not going to be a good look. Either he knew and knew this whole time and didn't say anything, or he didn't know and now he's in for the shock in his life. And now that he knows, now people are going to pressure him even more. And you know what I know what's so interesting? There's some people and some protesters that actually went down to Alabama to his house and are protesting, probably currently still right now outside of his house. Now they have even more reason to protest outside of his house. Slavery experts have stressed that the descendants of slave owners should not be held personally responsible for the deeds of their forebears, but they have also argued that the families that descended from slave owners like McConnell's are likely to have benefited from the labor of slaves that propped up farm families in early generations, a point made by many reparations supporters who have said the descendants of slaves were never compensated for the economic benefit their forebears made to white families. Basically put the former slaves received nothing, and everything that McConnell's family got from the time that they own those slaves going forward all went to him. His family, now him, into whoever comes from him afterwards going forward. That's all part of the reparations package. Everything it's a debt. It's basically what it is. It's a debt that has to be paid, and it will be paid. Smaller farms and plantations still benefit enormously from the unpaid labor of enslaved people, which likely helped them build multi-generational wealth, said Chuck Collins, senior scholar at the Institute for Policies, a liberal think tank in Washington. There is literally a list of institutions in this establishment that have benefited off of the backs of slavery, on the backs of slaves. This is why the racial wealth gap is so huge. When you think of a lot of these Fortune 500 companies, most of them being banks, how do you think those businesses got started? A lot of people will say, oh, it got started off their own merit. But when you dig deep enough, you find stuff like what you found out right now about the ventriloquist dummy known as Mitch McConnell. A lot of them will say they started off of merit, but then you dig deep enough and you find out it came from chattel slavery. And then got the nerve to shut us out. I had put a post up on Twitter. I said these banks have a lot of nerve to try to shut black people out from getting loans, unless it's a student loan, to start their businesses or buy a house or get a car. But then were the ones that ended up starting their own business through the bank, through the backs of our ancestors. The blood, sweat, tears, and everything else in between to get their stuff off the ground, and then have the nerve to shut us out. The 1850 and 1860 limestone Alabama census. I'm sorry. It was I guess it was supposed to be a picture here, but I can't see it. Anyway, it says Collins' assertion is supported by research done by 2 American professors and 1 Danish college professor who found that the southern slave owners were able to rebound more rapidly economically than non-slave owners after the Civil War. And you know, that's something that Palm Color loves to bring up, is that Civil War. We see recovery for the sons of both small and large slaveholders, as well as in the counties that specialize in non-plantation crops. A study published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, the nation's leading nonprofit economic research organization. No news articles were found in which Mitch McConnell has previously spoken of his ancestors being slave owners. And in his 2016 memoir, The Long Game, he wrote that he was descended from a long line of hard-working and often colorful owned slaves. Now look at that. He said he was descended from a long line of hard-working and often colorful McConnells. All you can do is just laugh at that. It says, but he did not mention that any of them owned slaves. So that lets me know that he knew. He did mention another James McConnell, apparently the father of the slave-owning James McConnell, who said he came from Ireland in the 1760s and fought for the colonies in the American Revolution. As a legislator, McConnell has generally been supportive of civil rights measures and said his parents, whom he has described as very enlightened Southerners, opposed the rampant segregation that surrounded his family in northern Alabama. He has said his hero is Senator John Sherman Cooper, a Kentucky Republican who died in 1991, best known for his breaking the filibuster against the 1964 Civil Rights Act that had been led by Southern senators. However, like most Republicans, he supported the narrowing of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court in 2013 and has also been an advocate for strong voter ID laws. Both positions have been criticized by current civil rights leaders for making it more difficult for minorities to vote. The U.S. Census Bureau used to count slaves and who owned them. It says in the 1850 census, Richard Daley owned 5 slaves, 4 of whom escaped, according to the document. And it says in the 1860 census, all but one of Richard Daley's 5 slaves and all James McConnell's 4 slaves escaped. In the 1850 census, his great-great-grandfather Richard Daley owned 5 female slaves ranging in age from 2 to 22. 4 are classified as mulatto. I wonder how they got to that status. I mean, do you really have to wonder though? Now offensive term for mixed race people. Their ages were 2, 4, 18, and 20. One 22-year-old slave was identified as black. None of them are named in the document. Little is known about the 4 female slaves listed in the 1860 census who were owned by another McConnell's great-great-grandfathers James McConnell. They are identified in the records only by their ages, which were 1, 3, 4, and 25, and by their race, mulatto. Richard Daley, in that same census, owned 5 slaves, 3 females and 2 males. 2 of those females, ages 30 and 11, were classified as mulatto according to the records. The other woman, who was 39, was listed as black. Both males, who was either 10 or 12 years old, and one who was 7, were all listed as mulatto. None are identified by name. It appears from the records that most of the McConnell and Daley family slaves managed to run away. The 1860 census slave schedule indicates that prior to the census count, all of James McConnell's slaves escaped, as did all but one of Daley's slaves. In the 1850 census, 4 of Daley's 5 slaves were also marked as having escaped, so it appears he acquired additional slaves between 1850 and 1860. There were a lot of more runaways, including some gone for years, than many historians have believed, said Gwendolyn Mitlow Hall, a pioneering historian who has spent much of her life gathering records about slaves. The enslaved in the Deep South escaped into the wilderness, including swamps, by boat to Cuba or the North, Midwest, and Canada, and some headed south to Mexico. Hall is a co-founder of the Slave Biographies, the Atlantic Database Network, an online project that describes itself as a database of information on the identities of enslaved people in the Atlantic world. Even if they had not run away, tracking down the descendants of slaves who worked the smaller holdings can be hard because record keeping in rural places like northern Alabama was a hit or miss, Tony Burrow, a Chicago-based African-American genealogist, said. Identifying the descendants and finding them would be a complicated project, and what I mean by that is it would take a lot of work searching for all kinds of records that might include the names of enslaved people. It is very rare that the story of an enslaved person gets passed down from generation to generation. There is the assumption that somebody with the same surname owned their ancestors, but that doesn't always hold true. In cases where better records were kept, however, it has been possible to track down the descendants of slaves. Let me just say this right now. I think any black person with the last name Washington most likely is a descendant of of George Washington's plantation. I mean, every Washington that I know personally, all of them had been black. Now, that was a true statement where they said when George Washington died, all of his slaves took on his last name, Washington. And like I said, every person I know with the last name Washington happens to be black. I have yet to meet a white person today with that last name. So if you are a black person, your last name is Washington, you may want to do some digging because you might come from I guess you can say that stock right there. Senator Mitch McConnell, it says, is 4 generations removed from slave owners on his father's side. NBC News was able to build a McConnell family tree by locating obituaries of his predecessors by searching through online genealogical websites like Ancestry.com and by tracking down his memoir and news articles in which the senator spoke about his relatives and his family's deep roots in northern Alabama. In addition, members of the McConnell family have built and posted a separate online family tree, which supports the genealogical trace performed by NBC News. These family trees do not themselves show slave ownership, but the names, dates, and locations of the great-great-grandfathers match precisely with the slave ownership records in the 1850 and 1860 census. There was no one else with the same names as the 2 slave owners, James McConnell and Richard Daley, listed in the 2 census for Limestone County. McConnell is now closely identified with Kentucky as it is best known politician, but he was born February 20th, 1942 in Sheffield, Alabama. Generations of his family had lived in and around Limestone County, which is west of Huntsville and just south of the Tennessee border. From ages 5 to 8, McConnell lived in a rented bungalow in Athens, Alabama, as he recounted. His paternal grandparents are buried in the Athens City Cemetery, and he has spoken proudly about the past, about his North Alabama roots. In a December 28, 2014 interview with the News Courier, a daily newspaper published in Athens that covers Limestone County, McConnell described his ancestry in detail. My great-grandfather was a circuit-riding Cumberland Presbyterian minister. We still have his original saddle in my wife's and my archives in Louisville. The senator related the same story in his memoir. My dad's grandfather was a circuit-riding Calvinist preacher who sermonized at a different church every Sunday, carrying his Bible in the saddlebags that I still have. Let's see here. Historians say that contemporary Americans can learn from slave owner genealogies how many families directly and indirectly benefited from the labor of generations of slaves. No one is seeking to judge anyone's ancestors, said Seth Rockman, a history professor at Brown University and co-editor of Slavery, Capitalism, A New History of American Economic Development. The whole conversation is about the American economic system as a whole and the degree to which the debasement of African descendant people created the structures through which other Americans were able to prosper. Lewis Kane, professor at Emeritus at Loyola University, Chicago, and an expert of the economics of slavery, said more Americans have been stained by slavery than they realize. I suspect with the mobility of the American population in the 20th and 21st centuries, most of us have ancestors that own slaves, including many individuals who did not arrive until well after the Civil War. The responsibility for what happened was collective, not individual. This was a very interesting read that I came across about old Mitch the Bitch McConnell, the ventriloquist dummy himself, and his ancestry. No wonder he's opposing the reparations. It's because he would stand to lose a lot from it. Like many of the others. Like I said, if you are palm colored in this establishment, 9 times out of 10, your family probably owns slaves. There's no getting by that. Just like 9 times out of 10, if you ADOS, your ancestors were slaves. There's no getting around that. All we have to say is cut the check and cut the crap. Y'all let me know what you think about this down in the comments. Like, share, subscribe. I will talk to you in the next one.